Alright, what we're going to be able to cover today is going to be about Chapter 3. It's the first of the 3 chapters that are specifically dedicated to the structural frame. It's entitled Getting Organized. Some of the things that we're going to cover for today are going to be the assumptions of the structural frame, some of the origins of this perspective. We're going to talk about vertical coordination versus lateral coordination. Then we're going to use a case study that interestingly juxtaposes McDonald's and Harvard for something that might not immediately spring to mind, but that will hopefully show you how the frame's perspective on organizations can highlight how these two vastly different enterprises can both be so incredibly successful within their given field. We'll begin with some of the assumptions of the structural frame. So each one of the 4 frames that we'll be discussing for this course will all have assumptions that are associated with them. They'll deal with what are the things that you need to agree to in order to help understand this frame. They'll also help hopefully to ground them in some kind of theoretical understanding of how they're not only different in each frame, but what the strengths and weaknesses of each of the frames are. So let's talk about some of the structural assumptions that exist. First and foremost, it's that the idea behind the structural frame is that organizations exist to achieve goals and objectives. They think about things as a machine, to liken that analogy. Every cog has its own way of producing movement that works towards the greater whole. Each gear within the watch slowly ticks away in order to make the seconds, the minutes, and the hour hands move on the watch in order to make sure that the assembly line continues to move forward. You are able to therefore manipulate the cogs to increase efficiency and create performance via specialization and the division of labor. It means that if you see a problem with an organization and you're thinking about it from the structural frame, you first analyze how do the pieces fit together, how are the links between the offices, the actual entities that carry out the objectives of the organization. How are they arranged? How do they fit together? Again, we'll come back to this phrase a lot, but how things work together in tandem, how they're linked together, how the pieces all come together to form a whole, that's what the structural frame is all about. There are appropriate forms of coordination and control. So what the structural frame privileges is the idea that form creates function, and in that form of function you get certain outputs that are either better or worse depending upon the way that they work in tandem with this particular organizational assumption. So organizations also work best when rationality prevails. So one of the structural assumptions is that chaos is not a ladder. It is not an opportunity. You want things to work formally through structure, and it's ultimately a way of understanding organizations, and rationality is a prevailing wisdom. Things should work in an A equals B equals C sort of things. Also, appropriate forms of coordination and control mean that rationality needs to work. If there's a right way to do something, then we all need to be on the same rational page. And sometimes, as we know when we're dealing with individuals of different persuasions and belief systems, it might not necessarily be that rationality is the method to which they're going to choose to align themselves. We're also going to say that structures must align with certain circumstances, and that means that you can change the structure of an organization. And what I need to say about that is that if you have a specialized job or you have a specialized problem, you're going to be able to hopefully find a method of organizing, collecting, orienting all of these things so that you can get to that goal. The goal is hopefully going to be easy enough that you're going to be able to structure the organization accordingly. Problems arise from structural deficiencies. So what does this frame do for you in terms of highlighting the deficiencies of a potential organization? It privileges and highlights the way that things connect together. And therefore, what you're going to be identifying is that if the supply line of a potential organization is not connected well enough to the distribution lanes, then the problems might be a communicative thread between those two potential sections of the organization. Structural forms and functions are another part of the chapter that I think are interesting to talk about. It's the idea that there's a blueprint for expectations and exchanges among the people who are in an organization and how you work with the people who are outside of an organization. You've got to understand that whenever you're talking about organizational structure, an organization can be small, it can be large, it can be something at a personal level, at the state level, at a national level, and therefore the design options for how you fit a bunch of different pieces together are almost infinite in their nature. You're making decisions from the very moment that you decide to create an organization, to develop an organization, to make that organization better. And good organizations are designed to fit the circumstances in which they find themselves. As you grow, as you develop, you're going to change the way that you're arranged and aligned, or you're going to fail. If you continue to maintain a small business mindset and you become a very large business, you're going to fail. That happens in reverse too. The blueprints and expectations that we're talking about here for internal and external players within an organization also have to bear in mind that sometimes when you downsize and you go from a company that is very large to going to one that is going to have a smaller scope, is going to narrow their focus. Instead of maybe being a big department store that offers all kinds of different options like a Best Buy, you might narrow yourself and say, we're only going to sell TVs. Notice that in that Venn diagram of all electronics available here versus just TVs, it allows you a degree of specialization that literally changes the expectations for not only what your workers need to know and be able to do, but how you interact with the outside world and the specializations that come along with that. Let's talk about what some of those expectations might look like in terms of a blueprint for success from the structural frame. Certain organizations have a blueprint for how you work internally and how you do things. Some more relaxed than others, but from a structural perspective, the people that work within an organization understand their role. Remember that one of the keys to the structural frame is roles and responsibilities. What you do within that organization and how you do it. For example, if you just think of a traditional office environment that we all interact with on a day-to-day basis when we're dealing with campus life, the secretary of each of the offices on campus have a certain set of specific roles. They're going to be the ones to disseminate emails. Sometimes they make copies. Sometimes they work with the professors on materials that need to be transferred from a hard copy to an electronic copy. So there's a lot of transitional information that secretaries or the administrative assistants do. And why I mention that is it's a little bit different from department to department. In Department X, somebody who's been established and been there for a really long time might have taken on more responsibilities. Also, there are certain departments that require different things from their administrative assistants. If you go to the office of the dean, or you go to the provost, or you go to the president of the university, then the people who work within that office face different expectational norms than those who are in the individual departments. The Office of Communication Studies or the Office of the English Department isn't going to necessarily face the same administrative tasks that you would in both places. And that might seem obvious, but that shows you that the blueprint for expectations is always, though the same, you're doing the same exact job. You would be hired as an administrative assistant, but the job itself might change depending upon the expectations of that particular structure of the organization. It also helps to understand that you might be hired in as an intern whenever you're first coming into a company. Intern is such a broad-based word. Think about all the different things that you can do as an intern. You could be a paid intern, you could be an unpaid intern. They have the horror stories that happen in popular culture where you're forced to fetch coffee and do grunt labor and be really badly mistreated. Then there's the opportunities for internship in which you're actually doing the job that you're interning for, learning the skills that you need, and making a networking opportunity where you actually get a job later. Those are both fit under the same concept. The structure is the same, but the expectations are different. When you talk about external players, how do you interact with customers? What is your customer service like? For some big corporations, take Hewlett-Packard, who makes computers and printers and things like this. Think about their computer division. When you buy a Hewlett-Packard computer, you don't go to the Hewlett-Packard store. You go to a Best Buy, you go to a Sears, you go to a Walmart, and you pick up a Hewlett-Packard computer. If you have a problem with it, you call an 800 number that they've outsourced their external communication to, and somebody who is at those call centers works with you to try to solve your problem. Compare that to a mom and pop organization. There's specialized gaming computer websites such as Exotic PC, iBuyPower, or CyberPower PC, where you can go and they'll build you a designer computer that you choose the components of from the top down. They deal with their customer service in-house, and some of those websites and some of those smaller organizations use comparatively the method to which they deal with the external forces as a structure and a function that either tries to elicit customer satisfaction or help them, as we'll talk about later, differentiate themselves from the crowd. That's the perfect segue here. When you talk about differentiation and integration, these are structural tensions. Each one of the different frames that we talk about is going to have tensions within them. So when it comes to differentiation, you need any section of an organization to have different enough work and to be divided in important and meaningful ways. One of the greatest failures of an organization, if you're trying to find a shortcoming of an organization from the structural perspective, is that potential organization has pieces within it that it doesn't necessarily need. That it's trimming the fat, so to speak, of an organization, is getting rid of those pieces that aren't really doing anything, that their efforts couldn't be collapsed into a different segment of that organization's structure. Take, for example, somebody who expanded too rapidly and got a tech department. Really, the tech department is only about 2 people. They don't really do a lot for you, and they seem to be siphoning off a paycheck that aren't necessarily required in order to make your business work. That would be an example where the division of labor or your differentiation within the organization means that particular job is not necessary. You might think about it as an elected board for sororities, fraternities, members of organizations. You usually have a president, a vice president, a treasurer, a historian, and so on and so forth. But some of those jobs, you wonder about the utility of them. The treasurer is keeping track of money. If you're dealing with money for your organization, that's probably a pretty important job. But a more tenuous question is, what does the vice president do except be on standby for the president in case of emergency? If that is their only job, are they really that important? Are they that necessary? In terms of the division of labor, perhaps they're not. But now you juxtapose a different tension of differentiation with integration. And that's the idea that all these pieces, no matter how different that they might find themselves being, need to fit together. They need to work together. Remember that organizations working towards a grand goal all need to know how the pieces within them fit together and are necessary and useful and valuable. So when you're working and looking at an organization, you need to make sure that each person has a job and that job is valuable, and that those valuable jobs all fit together in a way that makes achieving their end goal necessary, reasonable, easier for the people who are involved. There's criteria that you can use to understand differentiation. You don't just have to say you do this number of jobs. It can be about the function, yes, but but it can also be about what product they do. How do they deal with the customer? What place are they physically located in? When you're talking about these different qualities or criteria for differentiation, you might think of, if this section of your company deals with the customer, the other doesn't. I worked in fast food whenever I was a young man, and you had structures in place. There were certain people who worked in the drive-through window, so they exchanged money, and their process was entirely different than the people who worked creating and constructing the food. So there were people who, for example, when I worked at Burger King, would make burgers, would get fries ready and things. They didn't deal directly with the customers. They created the order that had been taken from somebody at a drive-through window or at a front counter. But those people dealt with customers, and the people in the back dealt with the product. But both of us were essential. If you've ever been at a fast food restaurant and things are backed up and everyone is angry and it's not going well, the people in the front are obviously blaming the people in the back. The people in the back are blaming the people in the front. And it's because the synergy between the two is not working very well. That's division of labor. That's how it comes together through integration. And that's why there's different criteria for understanding how this division of labor actually takes place. So sub-optimization happens whenever you lose sight of the big picture and the individual units are focused on localized concerns. So in that example that we're extending from the fast food restaurant that's backed up, it's easy for all of the people who are constructing the food to say, you didn't ring it up right. And the board isn't clear because you have had me have to remake things that you didn't punch in right in the first place. I didn't hear the customer. I didn't talk to them. And so for that reason, I don't make the correct food. Inversely, it's the people who are in the front who are holding up a tag that says, look, I said no onion. This has onion on it. You're supposed to put no onion. Each one has a legitimate gripe, but it's sub-optimized insofar as there's not congruity between the two pieces, the two divided labor parts that should be working together towards a unified whole. That's how the structural perspective works. It helps you to take something as seemingly mundane as an organization that is there to provide you fast food and can help you understand how those different pieces come together to form a unified whole. Now, there's different kinds of structure that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about vertical and lateral coordination. Vertical coordination is a hierarchical structure. It's the idea that authority stems from the top-down style of manager. There are rules and policies and planning and controlling systems in place that all try to make sure that the person on top's edicts or commands are followed. This is a typical dictatorial style of ruling, of leading, of a structure of an organization. This works best with smaller organizations, but sometimes larger organizations try the same thing. If you've ever thought about the phrase, the buck stops here, well, the person that the buck stops at is typically the authority figure, and that authority figure takes accountability for their decision, and everybody underneath them acts as a certain hive mentality, or the worker bees to the queen that try to carry out that particular boss's vision for what the corporation should be. They require performance controls and action plans, but ultimately it all comes down to the same thing. In a perfect world with vertical organization, the authority figure would be able to be everywhere at every time. But because that is not physically possible, they come up with a series of rules and plans and impositions on their workers that make it so that they are as close to being there at all times. An example of this might be something silly, but it will make the point. There are campuses where no one can smoke. Smoke-free campuses. One of the reasons that typically happens in order to get a smoke-free campus is that somebody who is in an authority position, somebody who is at that top of that vertical chain, has heard too many times or seen cigarette butts collected, and they don't like the look of it. They think that it's unattractive to their campus. And instead of trying to find smoking areas or making it easier for a customer-driven approach, they instead say, we're getting rid of it writ large, and it's just simply not going to be here anymore. So they make a decision, they create a policy or a rule, however you want to look at it, that says that this is going to be a no smoking campus. They put signs up in the planning phase, and they keep people from doing so and enforce those rules and policies with penalties for people who don't adhere. That's a method of vertical coordination. It's an understanding of how policy making works through an organization, and you see that happen in its day-to-day lifestyle. Lateral coordination is a little bit different. Lateral coordination has a little bit less of a hierarchical approach, and it has more of a multidimensional approach. What I mean by that is there is less attention to the structural legitimacy of a leader, and there's more attention on coordinating everybody to get onto the same page. If the buck stops here is a phrase associated with vertical coordination. The we're all on the same page metaphor will extend for lateral coordination. You need to be able to have networks of people that all share a similar vision, who might do things a little bit differently, but they all work together towards a singular vision. So if you know anything about clothing and retail design, there's a store called The Buckle that's in a lot of malls. And The Buckle has a very interesting lateral coordination because every store that is under the Buckle franchise has certain things that they sell, but the way that they arrange their store is completely different. You don't have to follow the exact same methodology that other stores that follow the Buckle are. Whereas a lot of Walmarts, for example, have the exact same vertical structure where they're arranged in the same kind of departments. The same departments are by one another. It's been regulated from the top down through policy making that it's going to be that way. With the way that I'm describing the Buckle and more lateral organizations, you can all do your own thing insofar as you're meeting sales goals and it's working effectively for you. When we think about education at the state level, and we say that we want to have schools be able to teach different things in different areas of the country, that requires a certain lateral coordination. It's the comparison between either the vertical idea of No Child Left Behind, or the core curriculum that's put forward from the United States federal government, or a lateral coordination where the states get together with other members of the community and try to come up with a method of dealing with a problem. In this case, not necessarily a problem, but an objective, educating young people, and they do so on the basis of what works and what doesn't work. You should recognize that there's strengths and weaknesses to both. With vertical coordination, it stifles creativity and it prevents people from being able to make personal decisions because of the unilateral authority. With lateral coordination, one of the weaknesses that are associated with it is, though it seems utopian in its nature, it's very easy for an organization to lose sight of itself, to not function as highly, to start to falter whenever different places are doing different things. Individuality and creativity comes at the cost of uniformity, and uniformity is sometimes the key to getting exactly what you want. And let's take that to come into our case study. You see, McDonald's and Harvard are both incredibly high-functioning organizations, radically different. McDonald's has a set of clearer goals that are more centralized and has really tight performance controls. They're a great representation of vertical coordination. On the other hand, Harvard uses diffuse goals, is highly decentralized, and has high autonomy or individuality, ability to do what one wants for professors, which is lateral coordination. So at McDonald's, you literally get the same experience as a consumer in any McDonald's that you go to that is a franchise McDonald's. They have purchased the means of production so that they sell the meat. they sell the buns. It's what you call a turnkey franchise. They sell training DVDs and videos so that the people who are trained at McDonald's have a series of questions that they ask you about what you want on that. Formally, before the Super Size Me movie came out, would you like to supersize that? There's a sequence of events that somebody who's working at McDonald's would like to do. When you're sitting at a McDonald's in the back and you're cooking food, there's a sequence of, do pickles go on first? Do onions go on first? How many rings of ketchup do you put on? I talk about working at Burger King. There's a parallel there. I could still probably from memory be able to create a Whopper or a Whopper Jr. exactly in the way that it's supposed to be created, where you take the meat patty, you put the onions on first, you put it was 3 onion circles, just so you know. It was 4 pickles that you would put around it. It was 3 rings of concentric ketchup so that it came down to the center. You heated the pummel part, the lower part, up in the microwave for 30 seconds, but there was a red button that you just touched. On the top part of the bun, you put mayonnaise on it, you put lettuce, and you put 2 tomatoes. The tomatoes held down the lettuce. Whenever you brought down the meat part or the pummel of the bun, you put the top part on and you'd made your Whopper. You wrapped it, you sent it along its way. Now I tell you that because think about how centralized that is. It's been, 17, 18, don't make me do the math on my own age here, but a great many years since I've had to do that, but I've memorized it. That's the strength of a vertical coordinated juggernaut, like a McDonald's, like a Burger King, where you have an exact goal, you can train anybody to do it. Structurally, as long as somebody goes through that exact program, they're going to be successful. At Harvard, you can get, if I'm not badly mistaken, last time I looked, it's over 100 different kinds of degrees. You could be studying to be in aeronautics. You could be studying to be an English major. You could be studying to be an artist. You could be studying mathematics to be an engineer. There's a great variety of things you can do at Harvard, and every one of those goals is so different that it requires a different sort of professor to step up and do it. It requires them to have the ability to teach in the way that they want. You have great minds coming up with great concepts, but you might get a radically different experience than you would if you had a different teacher at a different place. So when you're asked the question of why do these two really successful organizations develop such different structures, Harvard relies on having coordinating roles, departments, and it trusts the people who are in positions of power locally to make decisions, whereas McDonald's asks that from the top down you all do the exact same thing, and we have a greater whole because the hive is strong by listening to us. Each one of those give you the opportunity to be successful, and that's a structural vision of how organizations work. We've gone over a lot today in terms of what we've looked at. We've looked at the structural frame. We've talked about bureaucracy and how you can use the structure of an organization to be high functioning or weak. We've looked at differentiation and integration. We've also had how structure depends on situation and is situationally derived. We've used a case study with McDonald's and Harvard to hopefully show you how both vertical and lateral coordination in terms of an organizational rubric make it easy for some organizations to achieve vastly different goals. If I were writing a response paper to this, I might talk about the strengths and weaknesses of vertical or lateral coordination. I might use an example from my own life of when I was engaged in one or the other and its strengths and weaknesses, how they panned out in the experiment that I used from my real life example. I might talk about how different ways that an organization can differentiate itself using the criteria that we've discussed. I also might talk about how, in terms of structure, you might orient a new organization that's meant to achieve a goal. How would you choose to do it? Do a thought experiment of sorts. I want to create an organization that's meant to do X. Would I choose vertical? Would I choose lateral coordination? What would I do to try to structure it so that it achieves this end? Would I need a lot of authority? Would I need people in the right places? How would I position that? Would it be a small organization, a statewide organization, or a national organization? The last thing that I might give a response to this particular chapter is, how do the tensions of the structural frame change as you either grow or as you start to rescend back and perhaps downsize a little bit? Those would all be good options. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. And I hope that you're enjoying this as much as I am. Have a lovely day.